Hi, everyone. After my post on praise and worship, several of you were kind enough to direct me to the work of Dr. Tom Wadsworth on this very topic. And I watched his entire playlist. I reached out and contacted him, and he agreed to do this interview with me. I'm delighted to share this with you now. You're going to hear about worship and praise and a topic that I do not broach very often, politics. So enjoy.
They'd already broken into their own little camps, and they were kind of throwing little verbal hand grenades at each other, criticizing the other, thinking that they're in the right group. Well, this is hyresis. This is partisanship. Maybe it's a different conclusion than yours, but back off, dude. They serve another God. They don't serve you. There's a lot of people who are saying, enough, I'm out.
Dr. Wadsworth, it's an honor to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's good to be here, Joanne. Looking forward to our discussion.
All right, well, so first, let me introduce you to our viewers. Dr. Tom Wadsworth holds 2 master's degrees and PhD in New Testament, and his career includes 10 years in ministry, 10 years as a radio personality, and 30 years in corporate communications. He is a professional speaker and writer who has been hired to speak to audiences throughout the US and internationally. His recent videos on the topic of worship, which were based on his doctoral dissertation, have been viewed more than 100,000 times in the last week alone. These videos have been called groundbreaking, eye-opening, and a national treasure. At the same time, his videos have been called heresy, false teaching, and a bunch of lies. What on earth is going on? Something is going on. I'll say that people are hungry and ripe to hear what you have to say and the truths that you're bringing to light. So let's dig right in, shall we?
Let's go for it.
All righty. So here's the first question I have for you. I know this is a huge question. This is something you have spent over 50 years studying, but could you explain to us what is worship?
Okay. First, let me say that's the wrong question, but let me answer the question anyway. No, it's good that you ask it because everybody asks it. But I also want everybody to know that that's the wrong question. But if you wanted to know the definition of the English word worship as it is used in English culture, English speaking culture in the 21st century in America, it typically means something like to show reverence for a deity, to honor a deity with some kind of religious rites, that kind of thing. But to go to my point here, to define that word really is futile because what we're talking about is what we want to talk about is what Christians do in their Christian meetings. And as it turns out, the word worship is never used in the New Testament to refer to what Christians did in their assemblies. Now, that's a very strange and odd and revelatory statement, I think, but I call it the worship anomaly, this strange, odd fact about the word worship, that it is not used in the New Testament to refer to what Christians did when they were in assembly, nor did it refer to the purpose of why they had gathered together in those assemblies. And that was the focus of my PhD dissertation as to why the word does not appear in the context of Christian assemblies. So really the real question is maybe number one, what did Christians do when they met? What was the terminology that they did use if it wasn't worship terminology? And another question that goes along with that is, what do the Greek words mean that are commonly translated as worship? Even though they're not used in the context of Christian assembly activity, what do those words mean? So anyway, those I think are better questions that actually get us somewhere and trying to understand what Christians did when they gathered together in the first century.
Perfect. So let's ask that question. What did the Christians do when they gathered together in their assemblies?
Okay, Joanne. First off, I think you need to think in terms of a house as opposed to some sacred building. Further, we need to think in terms of a living room as opposed to a sanctuary. And we also need to think in terms of a small group of people sitting around in a circle rather than a large meeting group with rows and rows of pews all facing forward with stained glass on the windows. In order to understand first century meetings, we need to understand first century culture, because it's fairly clear in the New Testament that house meetings was the primary way that Christians gathered in the first century. They did not, in fact, have sacred buildings, Christian buildings that they gathered in the first century. So what did they do when they got there? They built up one another. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is a lost gold mine of information on what Christians should be doing in their assemblies, because it's filled with so much pertinent information that directly is speaking to Christian assemblies and what we do. And it has largely been ignored or forgotten. And there, to summarize 1 Corinthians 14, verse 26, Paul says, "What then, brethren?" He's coming down to a conclusion. He's going to nail it here. He says, "Whatever you do in your assemblies, let all things be done for edification." And that word means to build up one another, to strengthen one another, to help one another get better. That's the purpose of anything and everything that takes place within the assembly, and that includes music.
Well, I think that is very eye-opening, and I'm going to remind the viewers that you have an entire playlist dedicated to this topic. I mean, this just scratches the surface, and in these videos on your website, on your YouTube channel, they go much, much deeper. There's hours of absolutely amazing information, which I've gone through, and I will put a link to that in the description down below. So if we could move, and we, like I said, where you go into this so much deeper, but if we could move along to this phrase that's typically used, worship music. Now, worship music is today described as it's used to describe the time spent in singing. Now, as a musician, I have searched the scriptures as a lay person for a connection between worship, that concept of worship that you see, particularly in the Old Testament, where it's sacrificial. Worship is the bowing down, the offering of the sacrifices and so forth. And music seems to be separate. Music is associated more with praise and thanksgiving, as far as I can tell. So I would ask you, do you see a biblical connection? What is there between worship in the biblical sense and music?
The question itself actually is a bit convoluted. I know it's a normal question to ask that everybody asks, but when we want to get into the first century culture and into the New Testament, again, we have to appreciate the fact that, number one, the word worship, even though it does appear in our Bibles, is not used in the context of a Christian assembly, nor does the word, if you look at the Greek words behind it, nor do those words refer to what Christians did in their assemblies. So when you ask, is there a biblical connection between worship and music? I think the real question is, what was the role of music in first century assemblies?
Okay.
And so want me to pursue that question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
So it's certainly the case that in the first century church, they did sing. Singing was very definitely a part of first century assemblies, but it probably was not that big of a deal. When I did my PhD dissertation, I identified what ended up being a total of 15 major passages in the New Testament that talk at some length about Christian assemblies. And then I did a deep dive into each one of those 15 passages to figure out what's going on there. And as I recall, only one of those 15 passages even mentions singing. Now, singing and praising God is certainly a thing that we do in our assemblies. I want to emphasize that to make sure nobody misses that point. But it was probably a relatively rare occurrence in the first century church. And if you think about it also, think about the first century culture. It's different than ours. They didn't have radios or radio stations or the internet where they had constantly streaming MP3 music and people walking around with iPods and earbuds in their ears and listening to music 24/7 and being able to pick anything you want and being able to listen to the finest composers on the planet and the finest performers on the planet at any given moment of your life. First century is different. Yes, they loved music. Just like anybody. Yes, they sang, and yes, there were people who played instruments, but the degree to which we have become experts in the whole issue of music and musicality is much greater than probably they had in the first century church. So imagine in the first century church, you're in a living room or in a home with 15 or 20 other people. I think you're probably not going to have too many people who are musically gifted, but anybody can sing. And so, but the quality is not going to be that great, but they're going to be singing and speaking to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, seeking to encourage one another. Certainly there would be praising God there. But the point of the entire singing venture, the musical venture, which would have been brief, would have been to build up one another, to encourage one another to be stronger Christians, to stay with it and don't give up.
Exactly. I think it's really interesting that they sang hymns and psalms. They were all Jewish. In the very beginning, they were all Jewish, and this is what they did. They sang the psalms. And when you go back to the psalms, many of them have a direction for an instrument. So, this psalm is supposed to be sung with the lyre or with this something stringed instrument. So I think we may be able to infer, let me know what you think about this, that perhaps if there was a musical instrument around in whoever's home, they could have perhaps picked it up and strummed along with whatever psalm they were familiar with or could already play.
True, but remember that the Psalms did not have musical notes with them. It's just lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they had developed a tune to go along with a psalm from the Old Testament, it may have been unique to them or one that they had heard.
Yeah, exactly, precisely. And so it may be like a familiar tune, like they say. But anyway, I think that music, as a musician, music in the church has become something else. I did a piece on Kat Von D. She's a very popular recording artist, and she's a tattooist. Her whole body is covered in tattoos, but she came back to her faith in Christ. And she's also a songwriter, and she went and found a church. It was a large church in California. And she said that when she sat down, it felt to her so weird, just like she was sitting in a rock concert. The songs were composed in the same way that she writes for a prophet, which is to follow the format, to have the rise, to have the fall, to build up the emotions and all that. And she sat there and just felt dreadfully uncomfortable with the whole thing. What would you say about the current condition of music and this praise and worship, which obviously it's really not, it's a wrong use of the term, and to where it is today, where it is really like a rock concert with lasers and with fog machines and visuals and so on. Do you have an opinion along those lines?
Yeah, well, again, my research was in first century, and certainly they're not using fog machines and fuzz boxes and electric guitars and not that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but I would contend this, if I could try to summarize it quickly. First off, understand we have inherited a system where we think worship is the reason that we get together. In the New Testament, that wasn't the case, and that's a fact. They got together to edify and build up one another. I think these two things are different, and they lead in two different directions. Since the 90s, when the praise and worship music started to explode, the direction of the Christian assembly started to go totally toward worship. And if you think that you're doing the right thing, that that's what we're supposed to be doing, of course, you're going to accentuate the fuzz boxes and the fog lights and to make this great performance. But it's all heading off in the wrong direction. What we need to be doing is building up one another. And one thing I've often said, there's a difference between pumping up one another with, rock music in a concert style, or actually truly building up one another to where we're getting to be better, stronger Christians and human beings as a result of things that are said in the assembly.
Yes, exactly. Somebody made a suggestion on my channel on this last video I did on music and worship, and they suggested that perhaps, we have this machine in place. We have the stages, we have all of the electronics and all that. And so there's not much chance, I don't think, of us all going back to home church or meeting in homes. So how do we best, utilize what we have? And somebody made a suggestion, well, why don't the musicians go into sort of like a pit, like when you go to an orchestra and the musicians have their backs to the audience and they're playing forward rather than a performance. I mean, I thought that was a really novel idea as a way to sort of get away from the whole I'm up on the stage, which is very, very difficult for musicians to not have their egos just really puffed up when everybody's looking at them and so forth. It's just human nature. But I thought that was very interesting. I wonder, would you describe, if you can, what worship looked like in the Old Testament? When the Jewish people went to the temple for their worship, what was the worship ritual, or I wouldn't say service, but what did it look like?
Really good question. First off, there's 3 different Greek words that would have been used to refer to what was happening in a Jewish temple. Okay. The first Greek word is proskuneo, and it's found in our New Testament as well. And it primarily means to prostrate yourself. So the Jews, when they came to the temple, they prostrated themselves. First thing they did was to prostrate themselves before Almighty God. And this would have been in direct obedience to Deuteronomy 16:16, in which God specifically and personally commanded every male Jew 3 times a year to go to the temple during the feasts and present themselves before the Lord. And there's only one way to do that, and that's by prostrating before God. And this activity, this action is extremely well substantiated throughout the Old Testament, as well as in Middle Eastern culture of the time. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that took place in the assembly. When you read about people going to the temple to worship, that word does not refer to sing songs or to pray. Yes, they may have done that, but that word there is generally the word proskuneo. They went to the temple to perform their ritual obligation to present themselves before God, and that is by proskunesis, bowing yourself on your face in front of the deity. That's what they did in the Old Testament. Now, they didn't do that in the New Testament, so don't confuse that with what Christians should be doing. Now, the second word that would have been used is latreia. That's also translated as worship. But latreia, this is one thing I had to do for my dissertation. I studied every single time these words are found throughout the Greek Old Testament and the English and the Greek New Testament. Latreia is a reference to the sacrificing process. Another thing that people had to do when they went to the temple in the Old Testament, if you were a male Jew, was to bring a sacrifice, bring some kind of an offering. Deuteronomy 16:16 again says, not only when you come, you present yourself, and you must not come empty-handed, is how God worded that in Deuteronomy. You've got to bring a sacrifice or an offering, which might have been some grain offering. It could have been a cow. It could have been a pigeon. It could have been a lot of different things, but were all specified as exactly what you could bring to the temple in the Old Testament. Now, then the third word that is sometimes translated as worship refers to the work that priests were doing back in the holy place of changing out the showbread, and also cleaning the altar from all the blood that had been scattered on it, and processing the whole processing of the meats that were offered, because that was later on consumed by the priests, and sometimes even often given out to the people at the feasts. So those are the three things that were going on in the Old Testament, in Judaism, by Jews in the Jewish temple. None of that stuff is what Christians do today, except maybe in a metaphorical sense.
Yes. So to use the word worship, that's probably one of the biggest problems in the church is not seeing it for what it actually was. Face down on the ground, sacrifices, blood being spilled, blood everywhere. If you read it, it's a bloody, ritual, and then the priests doing their work. That encapsulates the Old Testament idea of worship. There in the New Testament, we are to offer ourselves as a living sacrifice. And I think that to the Jews, I think that if Paul's telling them to offer themselves as a living sacrifice, I think that would have been probably a difficult concept for them, because the whole thing was like bloody and horrible and all of that. So, how do you see that as being our true worship, which is what Paul calls it?
Yeah, exactly. And you nailed it there, Joanne. That's the Christian idea of latreia worship. That's the Greek word used there in Romans 12 when it talks about offering your bodies as a living sacrifice that is acceptable to God. This is your reasonable latreia. So that's what Christians were doing, and they needed to have in their mind. We do so out of response to the mercies of God, which is mentioned there in Romans 12:1. Because God has been so merciful to us, we then respond by offering our bodies as a living sacrifice. This is 24/7. This is not something that ever stops, or it starts at 10:30 on Sunday morning and ends at 10:45. This is a lifestyle of offering yourself to God.
Yes, and it's a moment by moment process. I mean, as the day goes along and as our will is challenged, we're not supposed to do something or say something or go somewhere. We know this, and we sacrifice our will, sort of like in a bowing down to the Lord. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to obey your will. That's how I see that living sacrifice, a way of life, really.
Yes.
So, well, let me ask you another question. So many people are discouraged by the state of our corporate, institutionalized church, and with the statistics are horrifying at how many people who say that they believe in God and they have faith have left church altogether. They've just left. What kind of encouragement could you offer to those people?
Yeah, boy, Joanne, this is a big deal, and this is huge. I've had so many people respond to my videos on YouTube, telling me they agree with my videos, and that's why they're not going to church anymore, which is not exactly the response that I was hoping for. But I get what they're saying. I've done citywide church attendance surveys here in my town for the last 40 years. And church attendance, by a head count, throughout my city has dropped by 60% over that time. And there's churches that are closing. There's many more churches that are on the verge of closing. So yes, this whole thing about going to church has completely fallen out of good favor, even by good people. And I think that some of them are looking at the assembly like I am, and seeing this gross overemphasis on music, and they're wondering, what in the world is going on in there? And some people just aren't musically inclined. Some people just don't get much out of that. And yet all those musicians up on the stage under the lights with the fuzz boxes and the smoke machines, they think it's wonderful, and we're rocking out. We're rock stars up here. People ought to be paying attention. But there's a lot of people who are saying, enough, I'm out. Well, first, I don't encourage anybody to leave any church at any time, but I would encourage Christians, no matter what church they're in, to find a small group of fellow believers with whom you can discuss Christian issues and the Bible and develop Christian virtues. Typically, these opportunities, strangely enough, are not found in church, in almost any denomination. We're talking Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Pentecostal, you name it, evangelical, I don't care. Typically, you just have this one-man performance up there at the front with this big emphasis on music, and people just sit there and take it. Well, I think there is an enormous cry from the inside of people to contribute, to do something, to participate, to engage, to do something instead of just sit there like a dumb animal and then just be ushered out when we're done. We're smarter than that. Mm-hmm. And from my research of the New Testament and the first century church, it was very much a one anothering kind of gathering. That's another word that's used a lot, about 100 times in the New Testament.
Love
one
that.
another.
Yes.
They're comforting one another. They're encouraging one another, helping one another, speaking to one another. All these things that have gotten lost in our church services as they stand today. So, but it is found back in those living rooms. Mm-hmm. It is found in homes. It's also found in church classrooms, where there's any small gathering of people where people have the opportunity to talk and express themselves, ask questions, engage with other people, and then grow as a Christian in the middle of that process.
Yes, thank you for that. I think you're just spot on. I spent some years in a home church, and I'm currently in a small group that meets weekly, and it's an outreach from the main church. And I truly believe these places are where edification takes place, where we can build each other, get to know each other. Accountability, that's another thing too. It's very, very important. And this just cannot happen in the modern church service. So I agree with you, and I would recommend that anyone who's listening to this, who attends a church service, like you say, don't quit unless they're heretical or they're doing some anti-biblical things, but find some small group to get that community, that real sense of first century Christian community. Yes.
Agreed. Yep.
So, all right, so here's another question. Now, you don't have to touch this if you don't want to, but I want to ask you a question about politics, all right? Should believers be taking sides in the political debate? We have these groups sprouting up through churches even. There's one called Evangelicals for Harris. There's another one called MAGA Christians. What do you think about that? And how was the early church involved in the political process in Rome and in Greece?
You know, I've actually done some work in this area. So, and some of the things I have to say here, I've never heard anybody else say. So let me give you something a little bit different.
Awesome.
First, in the first century, that political culture is nothing like what we have in America today, where we have the ability to vote, to speak our minds, without getting our heads chopped off. So it's completely different. So there's almost no comparison between that culture and ours. But there's some very interesting passages. And let me speak about one in Galatians chapter 5. There's a word there, a Greek word found in the list of the works of the flesh. And one of the works of the flesh is the Greek word hieresis. And the word, to dig it down and to see what's going on there, it's referring to partisanship. Get this. And the more work I did on this, the more I began to realize, wow, this is throughout the New Testament. Remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about he's being ashamed of the Christians there because they had divided into groups. Some were saying, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I am of Cephas, and I am of Christ. They'd already broken into their own little camps, and they were kind of throwing little verbal hand grenades at each other, criticizing the other, thinking that they're in the right group. Well, this is hieresis. This is partisanship. And this is a no-no. It's this particular work of the flesh is a very carnal, natural thing that humans do. And that's why the word is there as a work of the flesh in Galatians 5. But it's something that's completely forgotten by our culture, that this is a bad thing to be dividing into camps and to be demonizing people who are in opposite camps. Just forget the camps altogether and start to work together, Paul would say. And I'll go into one more verse that has been enlightening to me on this topic. And that's in Romans chapter 14. Here in Romans 14, Paul is talking about Christians who had a disagreement about certain issues. And he talks about the issue of eating meat sacrificed to idols,
Right.
or the issue of holy days. So some Christians felt there were holy days, and some said, nah, there's no such thing. But what Paul says to both of them is this. First, get this, let each person be fully convinced in their own mind. Now apply that quickly to the political thing. Let's say you're a MAGA Christian. Well, be fully convinced in your own mind. Let's say you're an evangelical for Harris. Be fully convinced in your own mind. Or if you've got a particular position on holy days or the Lord's Supper or the Holy Spirit, be fully convinced in your own. Study it out. Do the best you can. Go ahead. Figure it out. But then, Paul says, do not judge the person who's come to a different point of view. What he says, I think specifically, and is it verse 6? He says, who are you to judge the servant of another? It's before his own master that he stands or falls. You are not the judge. In other words, Republican Christians, stop judging your Democratic Christian brethren.
Amen.
And vice versa.
Yes.
Don't look down your nose at them. They have looked at the issue. They've become fully convinced in their own mind. Maybe it's a different conclusion than yours, but back off, dude. They serve another God. They don't serve you.
I think that's brilliant. The how you pointed out the what was the word? The petition divisions.
Yeah, hyresis. Yeah.
Very, very, very important. That is something, I mean, that's what you see back to music. You see the churches decided to divide over that. And so they now have a classical service perhaps, and then a contemporary service so that everybody gets their tastes fed and they don't have to be insulted or offended by, by this. And I think that that's a terrible thing. And so again, on the platform of the modern church, one of the things they can do, I think, is to bring that all back together, stop dividing on any of those issues. But that's very important. Thank you for sharing that as we're going to a very, very hot political season. The believers should show that's the word you use, partisanship. We need to show that. We're not going to be divided over anything in this world. So very, very important. Thank you so much.
Let me add to that, Joanne, if you don't mind. I once did a study throughout the New Testament, looking to all the places where there's a list of virtues, of things that we're supposed to be pursuing as Christians. And love and unity are at the top of the list more than anything else. Yes. The number one thing that Paul was most concerned about, Peter, Jesus, was that we love one another. That there be no divisions among us. And yet here in modern American Christianity, we're divided on every street corner, in various kinds of churches that are fighting with each other and condemning each other. This is all wrong. It was never supposed to be that way. We're already being very carnal by the way we're behaving toward one another. And as somebody once said, we're giving the world plenty of evidence that there is a devil, but not a shred of evidence that there is a God.
Wow. Wow. And the scripture does say they will know we are Christians, not by the music on the stage, not by anything else except by our love for each other, that we're the unity and the love. I think that's such a key takeaway from our time today. So thank you so much for your work in worship. Amazing, for your insight into some of these things. And again, I'm going to encourage everybody to follow that link down below. What is the best way for viewers to get in touch with you or to stay in touch with you or read more?
You go to my website, tomwadsworth.com, but really the majority of my my videos are all there on YouTube. Go to my YouTube channel and look for the name Tom Wadsworth, and maybe the topic of worship. Those would be some good search terms, and I think my stuff will pop up pretty quickly. And it's just in the last couple of weeks, Joanne, it has really taken off. I think at the beginning you mentioned that it's been viewed more than 100,000 times, and
Amazing.
that was true. That was true a week ago. Joanne, it's over 200,000 now.
Wow.
And starting to approach a 250,000. It's
Wow. That's
people
telling.
are, yeah, there's a topic here that's touching a nerve, and it needs to be touched.
And well, people want this. They want the community. We don't have that. People are lonely. They're out. The people who have left the church, they're out in the desert. They want, and there's nothing that could be a good thing for some people to go out into that place, like the prophets went out into the desert and they just got away from all the cultural stuff. But at some point we have to be in community. We have to be experiencing the love and the unity. Thank you so much for that. So,
Yeah.
And like I said, there will be a direct link in the description below where people can just click on it and it'll go right to you. I encourage everybody to go over and watch those. Tom, we wish you so many blessings as you get this important work out to many that need to hear this. So blessings to you all. Thanks for being here and watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
And God bless you, Joanne. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Tom. Bye-bye.